from different authors from different countries. And our first presenter, and I apologize for mispronouncing, is Gokmen. Is that any close? Okay, who is an assistant professor at the New Economic School and also a senior fellow at the Center of the Study of Diversity and Social Interactions. He will present a very interesting paper which looks at the question, I think, very relevant to Ukraine as well. Goodness, the floor is yours.
Do I need to use the microphone?
Yes. Yes. If you can.
Okay. Is there a clicker? Oh, yeah.
Yes,
that's the clicker. That's too many things. Can you hear me back there without the microphone? Can you hear me?
Oh, they won't be able to translate.
Oh, yeah? Oh, okay. Okay. All right, so I'm not used to using the microphone, so if that goes wrong, just let me know. So I'd like to thank the organizers first for having me here, and thank you all for being here. So today I'm going to talk about well-being in transition, and I'm going to talk about well-being in transition in relation to war. And in particular, we focus in this paper on the Russo-Georgian conflict as a natural experiment. So this is me. I'm Gokmen. This is a joint paper with Yevgeny, and we're both based at the New Economic School that is in Moscow. Where do I direct? Doesn't, yeah, I'm not. Oops, it comes a bit late, I think. Wait, okay, now it's working. All right, so let me get started. All right, so after the collapse of communism, the evolution of well-being in transition countries attracted a lot of attention, so it started attracting more and more attention, and there has been some research on that. For example, Guria and Zhurovskaya look at the transition countries in general. There's Lankas, which I don't have here, who looks at Hungary. However, in all this research about well-being in transition, the role of instability, political instability, or potential of conflict proneness of the transition countries remained rather overlooked, and it's been under-researched. So what we do in this paper is, in a way to fill this gap in the literature, we focus on well-being in transition in relation to conflict, and more specifically, we'll look at the indirect impact of conflict. Okay, so research question is whether there's an effect of the Russo-Georgian conflict of 2008, which I'm sure you're aware of, on the well-being of minorities in Russia, and more specifically on the well-being of Georgian nationals who reside inside Russia in particular. Okay, so our main focus is the well-being of Georgians and how they are affected by the Russo-Georgian conflict. And then in the last part of the paper, we also look at whether there's any spillover effects onto other minorities in general. All right, so why should Georgians be affected? Georgians who live in Russia should be affected by the conflict between Russia and Georgia. Well, for various reasons. Well, they might be subject to discrimination by Russian officials, so there might be official or unofficial discrimination. They might just feel alienated from Russia and from living in a country with which their origin country, their home country, has conflict. Or they might simply be negatively influenced just because of the conflict per se. So independently of with which country Georgia has conflict, so they might just suffer psychologically because they're worried about their friends, families back home. So let me go straight into, given that we've got 15 minutes, I'm gonna storm through the slides. So let me give you a preview of what we find in this paper. So I hope the research question is clear. So what is the effect of the Russo-Georgian conflict on minorities, Georgians in particular, who live inside Russia? Okay. So the first thing we find is that there's a negative effect on well-being of Georgians. There's a negative effect of this conflict on the well-being of Georgians with respect to both their own well-being over time and with respect to the well-being of the Russian majority. So that's our main finding. Then, so this is basically an effect on impact. So in 2008, when the conflict happens, there's a negative effect. Then subsequently, we look at whether there's any long-term legacy, there's any long-term consequences of this conflict, and we find no long-term legacy of conflict that goes beyond 2008. So there's a negative shock of conflict on the well-being of Georgians in 2008, and this basically dissipates, it kind of peters out in the following years, and we don't observe any long-lasting impact. Okay. Then we try to say a few words on the channels, and we look at whether there is any direct impact on the livelihoods of Georgians based on observable outcomes such as wages and employment, and we do not find any direct influence of conflict on these labor market outcomes. So basically we interpret this as the channel being more indirect effects such as just fear of discrimination in Russia, or just altruism for the people affected by the conflict, or sympathy, etc. Then the last thing that we do is that we look at whether there is any spillover effects of the conflict on other minorities, other non-Georgian minorities who reside in Russia. And then we see that migrant minorities, so these are the recent migrants that moved to Russia less than 10 years ago, are negatively affected as well. However, more local minorities, so minorities who've been in Russia for more than 10 years are not affected. Okay, so these are our findings. All right. So we basically contribute to the literature on subjective well-being in transition countries by improving our understanding of well-being in transition in relation to conflict. So conflict has been overlooked in the previous literature. And there's also a big literature on the impact of conflict on various socioeconomic outcomes such as level of GDP, trust, election turnout, etc. So we contribute to this literature by focusing on the effect of conflict on well-being. And perhaps the most related paper is this last bullet point here, is by Kupets and Obrizan, and they look at, they show that in Ukraine, average level of happiness declined substantially in areas that directly experienced war. So they basically look at the recent Ukrainian conflict. So the way we differ from that paper is that we do not study directly impacted zones. So they find an effect in the conflict zones. We look at the indirect effect. So we basically complement this paper by showing the indirect impact of conflict on well-being and by showing the fact that the negative effect of conflict goes beyond the conflict zone. So there's a negative effect, obviously, in the conflict zone, but it doesn't stay there. So there's a negative effect of conflict that goes beyond the conflict-ridden areas. So I'm going to give a very brief background. So after the independence of Georgia in 1991, there have been a series of skirmishes between the Georgian and South Ossetian and Georgian and Abkhazian forces. And in the meantime, in the 2000s, the relationship between Russia and Georgia began to sour as Georgia set on a sort of more Western course. And finally, a conflict occurred between Georgian and Ossetian forces in August 2008. And Russia got involved on the Ossetian side and launched an offensive against Georgia. And they went as far as 40 kilometers away from Tbilisi. And then towards the end of August 2008, a ceasefire agreement has been reached, And then finally, in the subsequent months, by the end of October, I believe, the Russian troops withdrew from Georgia. So this is the background. And then the data we use, as I mentioned, that we're studying Russia, so we're using Russian longitudinal monitoring survey from 2000 to 2015. And our main outcome variable of well-being is life satisfaction. So here, the survey question is whether you ask people to what extent they are satisfied with their lives in general at the present time. And this is on a 1 to 5 scale, from not at all satisfied to fully satisfied. So on top of this, we also have 2 additional outcome variables on well-being that are job satisfaction, so how satisfied are you with your job, and also health evaluation, how would you evaluate your health? Again, all of them on a 1 to 5 scale. All right, so how am I doing with time? 5 minutes? Oh, all right. Yeah, okay. So we first estimate this equation 1 here, which is for a subsample of Georgians, which is similar to an RDD design. So we have basically a 2008 dummy and then a second-degree polynomial to capture time effects. Then the second equation is basically similar to a diff and diff, so that we can basically compare the differential in well-being of minorities or Georgians with respect to the Russian majority before and after 2008. And we also look at the persistence in the longer term. All right, so let me jump to the results. So this is the Georgian sample. So just focus on column 4 here, where we control for things like wage, employment, education. And we see that in 2008, compared to the rest of the sample, there's a dip in the life satisfaction of Georgians. And this effect corresponds to about 33% of the average life satisfaction of Georgians. So it's pretty substantial. And then if you look at the other 2 well-being indicators, job satisfaction and health evaluation, they also dip in 2008. So here in column 5, the p-value is about 11%. So it's almost significant by standard measures. And health evaluation is significant at 5%. So all in all, this basically gives the main message of our findings that measured by these 3 outcomes on well-being, in 2008, Georgian well-being, the well-being of Georgian nationals in Russia dipped compared to their well-being in other time periods. Then we do a similar exercise, but in this case, we basically compare the well-being of Georgian nationals with respect to the Russian majority. And then again, the conclusion is basically the same. So if you focus on columns 4 to 6, we see that in 2008, the well-being of Georgians measured by life satisfaction, job satisfaction, or health evaluation dipped compared to the Russian majority. Just to give you a sense of about the magnitudes, in column 4, so this number here basically corresponds to about 23% of the average well-being in the sample. All right. Then we'll look at long-term, what is that, 1 minute of, okay, then we'll look at the long-term consequences, and we see that there is no effect that goes beyond 2008. So post-2008, there is no negative effect on well-being of Georgians. Then we move on. Then we look at, we explore potential channels, and for that, we run some auxiliary regressions of wages and employment so that we can have an idea about the direct effect. For example, Georgians might have been negatively affected or discriminated against on the labor market. And if that was the case, we could observe this with wage and employment. However, there is no evidence in the data for that. So if you have wage and employment regressions, we do not see any negative effect in 2008 on Georgian wages and employment. So basically, we interpret this as the effect working through other more indirect channels such as fear of being affected or just psychological suffering, etc. All right, then the last thing we do is we look at the spillover onto other minorities. We split minorities into two groups. What we call migrant minorities are the people who have been in Russia for less than 10 years, and the local minorities are the minorities who have been in Russia for at least 10 years. And our conjecture is that migrant minorities, so the recent migrants, are more vulnerable people, so they will be more susceptible to any internal or external conflict between Russia and some other minority group for the fear that they themselves could be affected, whereas the local minorities, they've been there for a longer time, so they are basically more established in terms of their networks in the job market, for example, or in terms of their job security, or they're also more likely to have Russian citizenship. And then what we do is basically we run the same RDD and diff regressions for recent migrants and local migrants, and we see here that, so if you look at these numbers here, or if you look at the diff results in panel B, we see that recent migrants seem to be affected by the conflict of 2008. So there is some negative effect on other migrants. So there's a spillover of Russian-Georgian conflict onto other minorities who reside in Russia. Well, naturally, the effect is not as strong as the one for Georgian nationals. However, if you look at the same results, same regressions for local minorities that have been in Russia for more than 10 years, there is basically no effect. There is no significant effect here, and in this case, the effect is even positive. So there is no negative effect on local minorities that have been in Russia for a long time. So the bottom line of this project is that we find a negative effect of conflict that goes beyond the conflict zone. The well-being of Georgians in Russia are negatively impacted in the short run, but there is no effect in the long run that goes beyond 2008. And this effect is not due to direct effect on livelihoods, meaning wages, or employment, so some other indirect channels might be responsible for this. And we also observe some negative spillovers onto recent migrants who've recently moved to Russia. Okay, so last thing is that, so this policy lesson, people ask, so what do we do with all this information? Well, we all know, I guess, that conflict is not good for people's well-being. But then, I think this hasn't been shown before in the sense that we know that conflict is bad for people who are in the conflict zone. But with this paper basically highlights that the negative effect of a conflict is probably underestimated because conflict has an indirect effect that goes beyond the conflict zone. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Gunesh. And
Yeah.
I think Alexander is ready to say
Thank you, Gunesh. Can I have my presentation, please? So I just prepared a couple of slides. Let me first thank you very much for this interesting paper. I really enjoyed reading it. Thanks for this. So basically, I don't have to really give a comprehensive summary, but it's exactly about what Gunesh told us. It estimates the effect of conflict on people who were not directly exposed to conflict and finds negative short-run but no long-run effects. And the proposed channel, in a way, is fear or anxiety. So I think this paper has a couple of really nice points. The strengths are, first of all, it's a very important and interesting topic. It's innovative, so it's really contributing something to the literature, and possibly also for an audience that's interested in more than just post-Soviet space. I find it very well motivated and well placed in the literature, so it was really a nice read. And also the data analysis seems pretty good. Okay. However, I have also a couple of questions regarding the paper. The first one is, of course, the year of the conflict. 2008 was not only a political conflict between Georgia and Russia. It was also a year of the financial crisis, and of course this raises questions about what confounding factors could have gone on in this year. So could people and migrants also suffer because of the financial crisis hitting Russia? And I'm going to give the third presentation today, and then I'm going to try to convince you that this is exactly the case, that migrants who go to Russia suffer during the crisis also economically, and this might in a way translate into their well-being. So you could of course account for this maybe by looking at regional or controlling for regional economic conditions or something like that. I think this is something you can deal with. The other thing is about possible endogeneity, something empirical economists always care about. So is there any sample selection going on? Are the Georgians in the RLMS really a random sample of Georgians living in Russia, or are these specific people who might respond to the RLMS or who might still be in the country? Do some of those Georgians go home because of the conflict? And these, I think, are questions you should at least discuss in the paper. And I don't think it threatens your results. It might even be a lower bound, but you should, I think, highlight this. Another issue that's something you cannot do much about is the sample size of Georgians. So from your descriptive stats, I found that the Georgians are only 0.1% of the overall sample. So overall 180 observations, and I wonder how many different individuals there are, since you actually use a panel of 10 years. So are there only, I don't know, 20 different people, or is this is not really 180 different people, right? This is 180 observations. So this is something I think you should be quite transparent about. Maybe this is not a cause of concern, but if there are only very few people, of course the results could be very strongly influenced by some observations. And then a final major issue is I didn't really well understand why you use an RD setup. In my opinion, this is, well, later on you use a diff in diff, but your first setup is, in my opinion, only a simple difference estimator. I don't think it's a problem. I don't see exactly why this should be a classical RD, because there is no lasting jump in the outcome variable, but this is a technical question, and I think this doesn't really do much to your results, but I think you should think about whether that's the adequate method. Some smaller points are the size of the results. In the discussion now, or in the presentation, you mentioned this and gave us some intuition. In the paper, this wasn't there yet, so my suggestion would be maybe to standardize the outcomes so that you can give maybe a better feeling of how large these effects are. They are actually quite sizable, so that's interesting. Maybe you could also add some more falsification exercises. You're looking into long-term effects. Something you could do is look at possible effects before the conflict kicks in. So is it true that there is nothing going on before? Is there no differences between Georgians and Russians beforehand? And then there is something, which is maybe important in Russia or in the post-Soviet space. The question is, how are minorities actually defined? Are they based on ethnicity or on citizenship? So this is something you don't discuss at all, but I think it's important, exactly because in the Soviet Union, people from different ethnicities could have the same citizenship, and this I think is quite important, because you mention minorities a lot, but you actually don't describe how you define that. Another issue, you look at people who are not directly influenced by the conflict and estimate their well-being. I personally have done a similar paper on the long-term effects of the Chernobyl catastrophe in Ukraine. So we also look at the fear of people who were not directly exposed to nuclear fallout. So the large majority of Ukrainians didn't really receive very high doses of nuclear fallout, and we look at how this affected their well-being in the long run. And you might actually want to link to that literature too, because we talk also a lot about fear and anxiety and uncertainty, and I think the channel could be pretty similar. And what we also do in this paper, something that a referee might suggest to you sooner or later, is to estimate the actual cost of conflict, the indirect cost of conflict. So how costly is it to make these people anxious and insecure? And then the final point, actually it's not a small point. While you were talking, I thought it's actually a bigger point. I didn't really understand why we wouldn't expect any effect on the Russians themselves. I mean, there is Georgia and Russia in conflict, so Russians themselves also might have a lower subjective well-being because they are also at war. So the question is, and I wrote this down a bit provocative, does war make Russians happy? I doubt it shouldn't, according to your own theory, that war makes people unhappy because they might lose their sons, their, well, relatives. So what is going on? Actually, your results show that there is a general deterioration in 2008. The question is this the financial crisis or is this the war, which also affects the Russians? So these are maybe my main questions. Thank you very much for the nice paper.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next speaker is, Karine Torosyan from our sister institution in Tbilisi, ISET, and she will present a paper on the job market outcomes of IDPs.
Sorry. Good afternoon. Okay. So thank you very much for introduction, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. I am forced to use the microphone, even though it takes away from my abilities as a Caucasian person. I do need a little bit more than just oral speech to communicate properly, but I'll try my best. So I'm going to take you to Georgia, from Georgians in Russia to Georgians in Georgia. The topic of my presentation today is job market outcomes of internally displaced people in the case of Georgia. And so I will be looking at the impact that the war and the displacement, the conflicts had on a large population of Georgians. And actually I'm going to show how long-lasting these effects are, unlike in the previous case. So this is joint work. Myself collaborated with Norberto Pignati, International School of Economics in Tbilisi, and Maximo Brizan from Kyiv School of Economics. We have heard today in the panel that the issue of displacement is an important issue and a growing issue. Number of people who are displaced is growing worldwide. And it was mentioned also that number of internally displaced people in the world is growing very quickly. There is a very nice map that shows regions in the world that host the largest populations of IDPs. And our region, I mean the post-transition region, is prominent on that map. And the main reason for displacement in this region is actually conflicts. If in many other places it could be natural disaster, in Georgia, for sure, it's conflict, and in Ukraine similarly. So basically, transition region is very much on that map. Now, unlike refugees, it was also discussed, IDPs are an internal problem of governments, and they are left to policies of the governments, and hence governments play a crucial role in basically solving issues that IDPs are bringing with them or facing. So there is a lot of space for policy making. Now, the situation that basically is true in this region is that because many of these conflicts are prolonged in nature, some are frozen, people who are displaced cannot just go back home. They have to stay and live for many years. In the Georgian case, it's been 25 years for many people. It's like half of your life, I don't know, 1/3. But people live in a place that is different from their home place. So it's a big challenge. And that necessity to live somewhere else, of course, means that they have to find ways to integrate in their host locations. And one important way of integration is integrating into labor markets. And that's exactly basically the issue that we want to bring out. Existing research shows that there are indeed big problems that IDPs face when they have to integrate in the local labor markets. The biggest problem has been kind of flagged as unemployment, but also labor force participation and maybe wages that IDPs earn might be a kind of an issue. Well, I mean, needless to say, your labor market outcomes play a giant role in your livelihood. And if you are, for many years, unable to find employment, viable employment, then it will affect your family situation. Now, literature that we found on the topic is vast, but most papers are mostly descriptive in nature because these are policy papers that are written by governments or international organizations dealing with the question. Some very few kind of academic papers that we managed to look through. Examples are on the board, looking at situation in Colombia, situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in Kosovo. And again, these are the evidences that show that IDP situation in the labor market is not very good. So there is basically kind of room for need for research, for policy making, and then there is basically lack of research. Now, this lack comes from many reasons. The most important one is data availability. Some data are there, but it's very sketchy. Observations on IDPs are a few. There is always a question of selectivity, who goes, who doesn't go. And in some cases, it's very hard to identify who is IDP and who is not. So many of these are more or less making it difficult to deal with the issue. Okay. In our attempt to study the situation, we looked, among other things, at cross-country analysis. We brought in data from Life in Transition surveys, the third round, 2016, which gives us national representative surveys for many countries. So we selected countries that have larger IDP populations for this region. Yugoslavia territories, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Russia, Ukraine, and other countries listed. So the survey provides a lot of data on labor market outcomes. So there was possibility to basically check how labor market outcomes are different for IDPs versus non-IDPs. The problem that we faced is that we identified a handful of IDPs still. So the number of people who are affected, when you look at this cross-country kind of samples, is small. We do see effects, negative effects. Sometimes we don't have enough power to identify how sizable or how significant these effects are. And so this highlights the importance of diving into basically samples that offer a larger observations on IDPs. Also, when you look at cross countries, you miss some specifics in different countries. I mean, you look at kind of generic picture, but situations are different, labor markets are different, places where people resettle are different. So country study is an important source to learn about situation. So case of Georgia, what makes it so special? Georgia has a large population of IDPs. Basically, according to different estimates, about 6% of current population of Georgians has IDP status. That's about 250,000 of people. In Ukraine, number of IDPs I checked is approaching that, which translates into 1 million and something of people. So it's a sizable population. Now, the situation in Georgia is also unique because after the conflicts that happened in Abkhazia and Ossetia, in a minute I'll show you a map because I want you to travel to Georgia with me. But most population of ethnic Georgians from those regions had to, they couldn't choose. There was not much, basically, do I move, do I stay? They were forced to move. And most of them actually moved into Georgia. So most of them became IDPs. There was some attrition, people left for Russia or other countries, but majority of people relocated to Georgia. So that kind of minimizes issues of selection, which many other papers are dealing with. Another interesting aspect is that Georgian government had a very different approach before, like until 2013, to how to manage IDP situation. It was a very passive approach. They were just, the official motto of the government was, we are getting those lands back anytime now, so these people just have to wait and we will put them back in their homes. So all the policies were sort of provide temporary relief, give them some housing, give them some kind of provision for daily life, but that's it. So no major steps on integration of these people in their home locations, host locations was kind of in place. After 2013, there was a drastic change. The government changed and also policies changed. And now there is a lot of proactive work to provide durable solutions for IDP crisis in Georgia. So that is also one interesting aspect. And I believe that learning what is happening in Georgia can provide a lot of interesting kind of knowledge for other countries, such as Ukraine, for example, on how to manage or mismanage IDP crisis. So this is basically the country of Georgia. If we zoom in there, you will see territories that I am basically mentioning. So this is Abkhazia, over here, and this is Ossetia, my kind of, I did the bordering. So, but basically, half of population in Abkhazia was ethnic Georgians, and quarter of population in a smaller region here was Georgians. The conflict in 1992-93 mostly kind of affected Abkhazia, and all of the population was moved out of the region. Here I have some rough numbers of what happened to people. There is an estimated number of killed people, about 4%. Some, not trivial, but some number of Georgians went away from the region, mostly to Russia. But then 80% of all those living in Abkhazia, Georgians, moved to Georgia, and they are now IDPs. This region was a little bit less kind of affected in the sense that there is only a portion of Georgian ethnic people that moved to Georgia at that stage. However, the next conflict that happened in 2008 cleared that up as well. So the rest of Georgian population in the region also relocated mostly to Georgia. So Georgia now hosts most of the ethnic Georgians who lived in these two breakaway territories. So this is the current situation. What we have is that, again, this is the very latest number of IDPs. It's, as I said, 250,000, and people reside close to the areas from where they ran, basically here and there, and then proportion is in the belt. So this one is Tbilisi, the capital, which hosts a lot of IDPs, and these are Abkhazia kind of adjacent regions. 15 minutes is so tough. All right, so research question. I will storm through slides like my previous presenter did. So basically the research questions are, do we see any differences in IDP labor market outcomes after they have been in Georgia for a decade or more? And labor market outcomes are labor force participation, unemployment rate, and wage rate that they command. And then we are hoping to see some dynamics in the process. We managed to put together a data set from Household Integrated Survey, which gives us roughly, so it covers 2003, 2015, and we observed 640,000 individuals in the original data set. Now, we can identify IDPs very reliably, and there is a lot of data on all sorts of variables that we can use later for controls. And so basically we can see the dynamics of the IDP situation. We performed a bunch of data checks to make sure that we have representative data set, that the refugees, that the IDPs we capture match the Ministry of Refugees and Accommodation kind of registry, etc. So we have a representative data set. We do focus on working age population for men and women. We do look at periods, basically, before 2008, which is the old wave of migrants after 10 years of living there. Then we look at 2008, 2012, which is crisis, economic crisis, but also the new wave of migrants. And finally, the last period is when the government wakes up. We look at different areas. I will not stress out areas very much. These are the big bubbles I showed on the map. But bottom line is we are around 250,000 observations with 11,000 observations covering IDPs. I will skip my basically preliminary, uncontrolled comparisons of labor market outcomes for the sake of the time. What we do is we basically, econometrics is very simple. We run 3 models: probability of being in the labor force, probability of being unemployed for those who are in the labor force, and for those who are employed, the average wages. We control for many variables, individual level, household level, locality level variables. And basically, we perform at this stage OLS estimation of models, which is first two models are basically linear probability models, robust estimation of standard errors. We control for time fixed effects and other things. So I will show regression results again in the how much time? So 5 minutes. It was 5 minutes, like 3 minutes ago. Okay. Thank you. No, I don't mean to complain. So these are the results. The top panel is the kind of overall Georgia, and then there is split between regions. But the interesting part, I think, is already seen when one looks at the overall picture. So these are periods. The first period early, before the war with Russia, this is war and crisis period, and this is new government. The gray bars are locals who also happened to move. So these are movers who did it like 3 or more years ago. These are movers who moved between 0 and 3 years ago. These are what I'm calling old IDPs, people who have been living in their location for 3 or more years. And these are new IDPs, these IDPs who are churning in the country and moving from place to place. And the comparison is, of course, locals who have always been living in their place. Now, we see that IDPs here this is labor force participation. They are significantly less likely to be in the labor force. This is like 10% difference. But those who are moving, the mobile IDPs who are allowed to search for things and relocate, they are in a better situation, not very different from locals who are moving. Crisis time makes everybody kind of enter the labor force, I think because other sources of income are drying up, so people are more keen on looking for work. We still have new IDPs having trouble being behind a little bit. And finally, this picture shows what happens in the latest period. There is now basically people who are moving, they are in a position of basically being a little bit less active in the labor market. Just one quick comment. The new policies of the government were to enable mobility among IDPs. They privatized their housing, so now you could sell your house and move somewhere else if before you were stuck in where you were. But these movements probably brought about facing a new place, facing a new situation, and drop out of the labor force. So that is our interpretation. Unemployment is the issue, which was an issue, and it's an issue on the rise. Situation with unemployment was difficult and even more difficult as we look down the road as time passes. So previous studies were finding as many as basically, 20–25% of IDPs are unemployed. In our case, every third IDP who is economically active is unemployed. And basically, despite, again, active government policies in the last period, we do observe that unemployment is still very much an issue. A quick tour of the basically wages and what happens with wages over time. We see that locals who move, there is a wage premium for those who are mobile. There is a mobility premium. However, IDPs old IDPs at least always have a wage disadvantage. And these new arrivals here dip very much in the labor force. And this is in the time when participation is at the level of locals. There is unemployment, so people have to take jobs that pay lower wages. And the light here that we see is that there is a column of a positive kind of a premium that IDPs, new moving IDPs, are enjoying. And this basically, of course, this is just a hypothesis that has to be tested, but this we attribute to government policies because in addition to enabling mobility among IDPs, what government did is that they created a network, electronic network of sending messages, announcements to IDPs about job openings and creating some employment opportunities. And this is visible in all 3 regions, so it's not basically just one region driving the result. So bottom line is that what we would like to say is that passive management of IDP labor integration parallels prolonged difficulties faced by IDPs with their labor market outcomes. And government policies that aim at resettling IDPs, like enabling mobility, should be paralleled by policies that help also those IDPs to find labor employment in the new locations. So there has to be basically a package. Then we would like to suggest that government should adopt more inclusive policies, spreading benefits to all IDPs and not just targeting certain groups and locations. I didn't have time to go into the smaller regional kind of pictures, but there are some regional differences. Basically, we would like to say that given Georgia is now on this wave of trying many policies, this is a great case study for even further analysis of how those policies impact IDP outcomes and should really be helpful to understand the situation in many other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Karine.
Yeah. Thanks. All right, I'll go ahead. Thank you. All right, thanks for the opportunity again. I really like the paper, and I think I learned quite a lot from this paper. It's I believe it's a very important topic, especially in transition countries. I was not aware of the magnitude of IDPs, and it's overwhelming. And also from an academic perspective, there are not many studies in the literature, so it's under research, and this paper addresses this gap in the literature. So what they do is, very simply, they look at the household surveys between 2004 and 2015 in Georgia, and they basically show that labor market outcomes of IDPs are worse than local residents. Okay, so I got a bunch of comments, and the first one I'd like to make, which I think is the most important, in my opinion, is that the contribution is not sufficiently identified. So in the literature section, the authors talk about 2 papers on IDPs in Bosnia and Colombia, and both of these papers also find a negative effect, negative job market effect on IDPs. So the authors, I think, do not sufficiently pin down the difference between those papers on Bosnia and Colombia and the current paper, so the contribution is not sufficiently highlighted. My second comment is that the authors start out by pointing out the limited evidence in the literature that is due to mostly data limitations, so that you cannot identify IDPs, and lack of pre and post data. And then the authors argue that they fill this gap. I mean, in a way, they fill this gap in the sense that they identify IDPs, but at the same time, I think when I read this, it basically, at least for me, it created the expectation that the current paper fixes this problem of not having pre and post data, and this paper as well does not have pre and post data. So basically, it's not immune to the same problems that the literature suffers from. Then I was wondering if there is no question on prior status, such as have you ever been an IDP in your life, type of question. Just food for thought. All right. My third comment is about the fact that there's high unemployment and a high degree of self-employment in Georgia. So the self-employment, which the authors call abnormally high, is about 64% here, 64% self-employment with large share of subsistence farming. Then this made me think, how much we can extrapolate from results on Georgia, because Georgia might be, kind of an upper bound for the negative effect on IDPs, because if everybody does their thing, they're self-employed, there's no room to hire people in the first place, right? So compared to the other countries, for example, in the LITS sample, you do not find any effects in the LITS sample compared to the Georgian sample. Is that because the IDPs are underrepresented or they're not well identified in the list sample, or the structure of the economy in the list sample countries are different than the Georgian economic structure, in the sense that everybody's self-employed. So if you move to somewhere, it doesn't matter if you're IDP or not, you cannot be hired anyways. And I think you address this issue to a certain extent by looking at the non-IDP movers, and also Tbilisi being the capital should be more immune to this problem. So discussion of Tbilisi and non-IDP movers, I think, helps address this problem a little bit. Then in table 5, in period 3, we see that new IDPs earn more than non-IDPs, although they have lower labor force participation and higher unemployment rates. Their incomes are higher, so this was kind of puzzling to me. Is this because of sample selection? As you go down through the subsamples, as you subsample from labor force participation to unemployment to the people for whom you can measure the income, you're not exactly working on the same sample. So it's a bit difficult to get my head around this. It was not obvious to me. And at the same time, you talk a bit about the discussion of the government programs, but I don't think it's enough. So I think spelling out what these government programs exactly are early on might help the reader to understand whether this effect is due to the subsidies, government programs, or it's just driven because of the sampling issue. Kind of a similar comment about table 6. This is a personal taste thing, I think, but I find it too crowded. There's way too much information on table 6, and it's hard to interpret. You could perhaps try to simplify that. Then also, going back to the same comments I made about table 5, you should perhaps interpret the results in tandem. Again, when you move from labor force participation sample to unemployment sample to the income sample, the samples change. So it's not clear what drives what. You have some discussion about that on page 13. Perhaps there should be a bit more discussion about that. Or you could, for example, report employment. Then you will be working on the same sample as the labor force participation, right? Then you would be working with 2 comparable samples, and you could report labor force participation as well as employment, so that we know what is driving what. Then a couple of things that came to my mind, whether you've tried the duration instead of creating indicators for new IDPs and old IDPs to get a sense about the evolution of the effect. You could simply include duration and duration squared to see whether the effect persists over time. Yeah? Okay, that answers. And then one small comment that I have is that it seemed to me that the income regressions are in levels. My experience is that the income data are usually right skewed, and it's kind of common practice to regress log income instead of level of income on various factors. So there's this exercise about the LITS countries and the IDP indicator in that data set, but then the discussion is kind of limited, and then you don't really show the table. It's somewhere in the appendix. You don't exactly focus on that table either. Then it may not be comparable either, because there are different conflicts going on in these different countries. So it's not very clear whether these different IDPs in different countries are comparable in the first place. Then I was just thinking maybe, you're not discussing it that much anyways. Would it be better to remove it altogether? Then I think one last thing. Yeah, this last point, selection of IDPs. I think you give a good, convincing discussion about this, and I think it's important. I was wondering if there is no information about where these people, you ask people whether you're an IDP, and then if the person says, well, I am an IDP, I guess it's a natural thing. Well, where did you come from? So there's no such question.
No, they only ask if you're from the same region or from another region. They don't specify.
Oh, I see. Because, if you had that information, related to the discussion you have in the paper, you could just focus on the Abkhazia subsample, given that all the people left in early 90s, if you just run the same regressions on the Abkhazia subsample, this could basically address the selection problem and then see if the results are consistent throughout. Okay, that's it. I've got some minor things, but yeah. All right, thanks.
Thank you, everybody, both to Gunesh and Karine. I would like to use an opportunity maybe to collect one or two questions to either of them, given that we are talking about the same conflict from different sides, Georgians in Georgia, Georgians in Russia. Maybe someone in the audience wants to ask something.
Yeah, I have a question about the first paper. So you said there is no long-lasting effect on Georgians in the Georgia. I was wondering whether it's more due to the change of the composition of Georgians, because those who were afraid of the conflict, they moved back to Georgia, or whether it was due to decrease of the intensity of the feeling. Do you have any data on that or anything?
Yeah, you got a point. So it could be that. Yeah, I think you got a point. It could be that the people who were unhappy about the conflict, maybe they just left and went back to Georgia. So that could be the case. But I don't have any evidence on that, yeah. Thanks.
One more question, maybe? Okay, then if no, we are going to our last but not least very interesting paper that will be presented by Alex Danzer. And Alex is a professor now at the Catholic University of Eichstätt-Ingolstad. Right? But he's a very good researcher and was visiting different institutions, and it's very long time aware of labor market issues in Ukraine and in other transition countries, and is indeed a very good specialist on that issue.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So I'm going to talk about something very different. I'm going to talk about labor migration and labor migrants and how they fare during the financial crisis. I will focus on two different things. On the one side, the economic well-being, and on the other side, something we label social well-being. I will talk a little bit more about what we mean by that. So let me start with the motivation of the paper. So as you all know, there was a big global financial crisis, and such a crisis led to the shrinkage of GDPs across many countries. And of course, this induces possibly a struggle for jobs and resources. So people who compete for jobs might find themselves in a much more difficult situation suddenly because jobs get lost. And we thought, okay, how is this actually going to affect migrants? So migrants are a very special group of workers in a country, and they are more vulnerable, possibly. So do they make very bad experiences, or is the crisis for them actually not a cause of concern? So we, in this paper, focus on one very specific migration corridor. So we basically take a case study. We look at migrants from Tajikistan to Russia, and want to investigate how they fare during the financial crisis. And there is some evidence, some non-academic evidence, that indeed migrants suffer a lot during the crisis. For instance, there are opinion polls by the Levada Center in Russia suggesting that the xenophobic tendencies in the Russian population went up during the crisis. So when people were asked how welcoming they were against immigrants, then well, they became less and less so, simply because they feared to lose their own jobs, and they saw immigrants as competitors, in a way taking away their jobs. There's also evidence that there were more physical attacks on Central Asians across Russian cities. There is an article in The Economist of the year 2013 suggesting that more than 30 workers, most of them illegal, from Tajikistan and other Central Asian countries were actually killed in Moscow and some other cities. So apparently there is something going on, and the migrants might suffer a lot during the crisis. So what we try to do is, first of all, structure a little bit what we mean by well-being. And here I already put up a couple of possible consequences migrants might suffer from during the crisis. One, of course, is that if jobs get scarcer and there is more competition, this could lead to lower wages. It could also affect migration durations. If people lose their jobs, they might actually migrate much shorter. However, there is also a literature arguing that during the crisis, people try to hibernate the crisis in the destination country. So in a way, even if they lose the job, they will use up their own money in order to stay in the destination. So the only thing they don't want to do is go home, because they fear in the future it might be much more difficult for them to come back. So in the end, they are fearing kind of a closed door from Russia and stay in Russia despite the fact that their economic conditions are souring. However, there are also some very severe social consequences for labor migrants. One, of course, is that workers might be pushed into illegality. And here, when we talk about illegality, we don't think about the illegal entry into Russia, because Russia and Tajikistan have a visa-free regime, so Tajikistani migrants can enter Russia legally. We are talking about illegal employment, so whether you have a contract, whether you are registered, whether someone pays taxes for you. Yeah? And of course, if you as an employer want to bring down your costs, you could hire people illegally, and this makes them even more exposed to your own, well, whatever you do. The second thing people might experience is harassment, so open discrimination against them. Let's say if you're construction workers, you might be harassed by someone who's working with you but dislikes foreigners, or you might walk on the streets to go shopping and people might harass you because they see you look different, you are not Russian. So these are things that could well happen also during times of crisis. And finally, one thing we observe, especially in the Russian case, is that the government also takes action, that the government tries to send back people. This is something governments do whenever or some governments do whenever the political opinion becomes more difficult and the population wants to see some action, so government starts deporting workers, especially the illegal ones. And basically, these are also the outcome variables we want to shed light at, and I will talk about this in a second. So what do we contribute with this paper? First of all, we want to conceptualize multidimensional well-being. So we talk about different dimensions of well-being and, in a way, track migrants during the financial crisis. That means we also have available a couple of new indicators in a panel perspective. Not all of these indicators are in a panel perspective, but some of them. So we have repeated information on the same individual or on the same individual migrating for a second or third or fourth time. And then what we also do is we want to really investigate this crisis hibernation hypothesis. So do migrants really stay longer in the crisis? And we do this by shedding light on the heterogeneity of migrants, and we find some quite surprising results. In the end, the financial crisis is kind of a breaking point for many migration histories. So some people migrated up to the financial crisis and then stopped migrating. Some other people continue migrating, so they went to Russia before and after the crisis, and some others started during the crisis, and we want to shed light a little bit on the different characteristics of these people. So this is our conceptualization of well-being of migrants. Here you see that we basically focus on economic and social well-being. We are combining these two things. Something we cannot do is subjective well-being. So in the keynote lecture this morning, you heard a lot about happiness, subjective well-being, and we simply don't have data on this for all the migration spells. We only could measure this for migrants once they return home, but that's not interesting to us. So what we have is a panel of data from 2001 to 2011. I will talk about the data a bit more, and in between of this panel, of course, was the financial crisis, and we want to see how these indicators change as the crisis passes on. So these are our three research questions. First, we want to know how have economic and social well-being evolved during the crisis, how have they developed? Then we want to know, because we find that illegal employment and harassment go up during the crisis, we want to know, does this have any economic consequences? And thirdly, we want to know how different are peoples who migrate during such a crisis. We want to shed light on the heterogeneity and analyze who actually stops migrating during the crisis. The data we use come from the Tajikistan Household Panel Survey. It's a survey that was initially conducted by the World Bank in the year 2007. And then I worked for the World Bank in 2007, 8, and 9, and we developed a second wave of this survey and created a panel. And then in the year 2011, my co-author Barbara Dietz and we organized more money to have a third wave of this panel. So it's a 3-wave panel. And it also contains, and I think that's the novel contribution of this data, a complete migration diary for 2001 to 2011. So you basically have information on all the migration steps people, all the migration spells people have performed during that 10-year period. So we see that many people migrate quite often, and almost all migrants from Tajikistan are temporary migrants. So they go to Russia maybe in spring and return in fall at some time. The average duration is around 8 months. That's what people stay there, normally go to Russia and then work on the construction sites of Moscow or other large cities. Yeah? And this is exactly what we observe. So, yeah, that's what I said. We overall have 1,432 migration spells in this data set. Yeah, it's not only a migrant survey, but out of those observations, we can generate 1,432 observations by roughly 600 individual different migrants. Yeah? These are the outcome variables we look at. We want to know how long do people stay abroad. In months, what do they earn? What's the log net wage per month? We have to focus, of course, on the net wage because illegal workers, well, they don't have a gross wage. And then by multiplying these two things, we look at the log net income per migration spell. This is kind of the overall take-home pay you generate during a stay. So the first 3 outcomes are the economic well-being outcomes, and the final 3 ones are social well-being. So is your work legal, registered or not? Are you harassed during your stay? And how did your migration spell end? Were you deported by the government? Yeah? So this last bit is generated from a variable about how the migration spell ended, whether you returned voluntarily or not, and if involuntarily, there are a couple of candidates you can answer, and one of them is I was deported by the government. So in a way, I was forced to go home. So the methodology is pretty simple, and we actually don't claim any causality here. I think the contribution of this paper is not to show you causal effects, but showing you evidence on how different indicators evolve over time. However, of course, the crisis was in a kind of exogenous shock to the people, so we are pretty confident that this is close to some causal interpretation. Yeah? So the first equation is how do outcomes evolve during the financial crisis, and here you see that we regress our outcomes, which are individual, spell, and time-specific on a crisis dummy, some X vector of covariates, which includes gender, education, age, oblast of origin. And then we have year fixed effects and destination sector fixed effects. That means which sector do you work in Russia. Most of the people work in construction, but some others work also in healthcare or nursing, especially women. And some also work in trade or related sectors. And then in a second step, we expand this equation by also adding our dummy for illegality and harassment. And once we include harassment, we only can use a migrant cross-section because harassment is observed only once per migrant. Okay, just to give you some indication of what the data say descriptively, here is a figure showing the illegal work status of our migrants, and on the vertical axis is the fraction who report to work illegally abroad, and you see how this evolves from 2001 to 2011. The black solid line is the actual data, and the dashed line is something we call the non-crisis scenario. So we compute how would the illegality rate have evolved in the case there was no financial crisis. And you see there is this jump up in the year 2008, and this stays relatively constant, roughly 10 percentage points higher than in the case without financial crisis. So the two vertical lines just mark the beginning and, well, the end of the financial crisis proper. Of course, there are long-term effects, but this is really the year in which the financial crisis hit Russia strongest. The second indicator is harassment, and you see harassment is overall increasing in Russia against Tajikistani migrants. The question here is really about the first experience. So when did you for the first time experience harassment? And we also don't distinguish between whether people were harassed by their employer, by the police, by people on the streets. We don't care about this. We just want to know when was your first encounter with some kind of discrimination. And you see this also starts jumping up, especially in the year 2008, and then it's actually going down a bit after that. Now I want to show you the outcomes and how the financial crisis has affected them. You see here is our financial crisis dummy, and you see during the financial crisis migrants go abroad longer. This is kind of supporting this crisis hibernation hypothesis. So apparently migrants really try to stay longer by 1.5 months in the destination. However, you also see that they earn lower wages in the crisis year, and their overall take-home pay is lower. Yeah? As with respect to social well-being, we see that there is an upshot of illegal work relations by roughly 12 percentage points, and people respond much more to the question, were you harassed in this year for the first time? It's almost 14 percentage points. And we also see some positive correlation for deportations. I have to say that the baseline of deported people is pretty low. It's roughly 2%, so only a really small fraction of migrants is in fact deported. However, meaning another 2 percentage points is an increase by 100%. So it's a very large effect despite the fact that this coefficient looks so tiny. Okay, so this is the answer to our first question. We see some mixed evidence in terms of economic outcomes. People stay longer, but they earn less. But in terms of all social well-being indicators, we see really a souring condition, and their life gets worse. Now we want to bring together we want to bring in the illegal work relation and harassment dummy to the economic outcomes, or, well, that's the social outcome. And what you can see here, we also include the financial crisis dummy because we want to make sure that these, what we catch up here, or what we capture, is really an independent effect. So in the financial crisis, migration durations are longer. However, those people who migrate illegally, they stay much shorter. Yeah? This is independent of the financial crisis because the interaction terms we also use in our regressions, they are all insignificant. So apparently the financial crisis has a specific effect on migration duration, while illegal work relations also have a slightly different effect, and they go in opposite directions. However, with respect to the log wage, we see that both the financial crisis as well as illegal work relations lead to or are associated with lower log wages, and these effects are relatively large. So these are 25 to 30%, in fact. So much lower wages for people migrating during crisis years or being illegally employed. We also see that harassed people, well, apparently harassment is independent of these economic outcomes. They don't earn less, they don't earn more. So this seems pretty independent. And then finally we look at deportations, and we see that deportations really go up during the financial crisis. People who are illegal are also apparently deported more often, and people who report harassment are also more often deported. Of course, we don't know in which direction the causality here goes, but there is a clear association. And then, regarding our last research question, we formed 3 groups of migrants: those who stop migrating during the crisis, those who continue migrating, and those who start migrating. And now you see a very large heterogeneity. Those who stop migrating are those who really do much worse in terms of economic outcomes. Yeah? So what you see here is the difference in these 3 economic dimensions between crisis and non-crisis years for this group of migrants. So you have to read this bar in a way to say the migration duration for those who stopped migrating during the crisis is almost 0.2 months shorter in the crisis year than in all the previous years. Yeah? And you see they have a very severe loss in wage and in total income, and this probably also explains why they actually stop migrating. So it's kind of a rational decision to stop migrating. Because they were treated really badly economically, they decide not to go back to Russia in the coming years. What you also see is that there are some people who actually start migrating during the crisis. We know this from earlier research, that the number of migrants from Tajikistan to Russia is actually going up overall. And this is exactly this group here during the crisis. And you see these people, they stay much longer. So part of this crisis hibernation effect is just due to the fact that there is a recomposition going on. Some people are leaving, those with very short migration durations. Some new ones are coming, and they have very long migration durations. But even for those who continue, we see indeed that durations increase. Okay, let me conclude. We find that the financial crisis is associated with lower wages and incomes, with longer migration durations, and with overall poorer social well-being, at least as we define it, with illegality, harassment, and deportation. We also find that this illegality is associated with lower economic well-being and more deportation, but we don't find that harassment is in any way related to economic outcomes. And then we find that migrants during the crisis are very diverse. There are these 3 different large groups, and those who stop migrating during the crisis do this for economic reasons. We also check a similar picture to that with social outcomes, but we actually don't find much going on there. So the main driver behind stopping migration to Russia for Tajikistani migrants is really economic conditions. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Alex. And our next speaker will be Olga Kupets from Kyiv School of Economics, who will discuss and comment and suggest to Alex's paper.
Thank you. I have several minutes, so I have some presentation. Yes. I like the idea that you analyzed the effect of crisis not only on economic indicators, as we economists usually do, but also on important social aspects of well-being. And using this long panel data looking before, during and after the crisis, and very interesting exercises. So a lot of strengths is, and I have still open questions, some suggestions. So having a short of time, I will focus on this. I would suggest to elaborate more this section on the migration corridor between Tajikistan and Russia. I work on migration. I'm aware of this specific corridor, but for the readers, maybe it is important to provide some statistics why Russia is important for Tajikistan as a destination region, why Tajiks are important source of foreign labor for Russia, what is the difference between other migrants from other countries, Ukrainians, Moldovans, and so on, in order to answer the question, is really a migration corridor between Tajikistan and Russia really unique in terms of the spillover effects from the financial crisis, and especially because you focus on these issues of harassment. And I remember then I participated in migration projects from 2011 to 2013. At that time already Russian researchers told that we see that the share of Ukrainians that was the largest was going down, And we worry a lot because of this possible harassment, increase of harassment, deportation, and so on, because of different physical appearance. Ukrainians, Moldovans, they look differently in Russia than Tajiks and other people from Central Asia. And so I think this is important to provide some context for the people who do not know this. And minor avoid repetitions about impact of the financial crisis on the Russian economy on 2 pages. And then several open questions about the measurement, about income variables. Are they nominal or real? Nothing mentioned in the paper, in the appendix. Also, how is it measured? If you have a quite long migration spell, is it last wage for the last month's worked, average in the beginning? For short term, it is okay, but if it takes longer, and you have a very important variable of financial crisis, what about, again, longer spells that started in 2007 and then they ended in 2009, for example? So how you take into account these? So maybe you dealt with the issues, but just to explain clearly in this section on data and methodology, and also important question about working hours. I believe that most migrants, they work more than 40 hours, but it depends on the sector. So then we compare monthly wages. How do we control for these differences in hours worked, in fact, by migrants? Also important question about illegality. You mentioned now during your discussion that it is about, in fact, it is informal employment, as we call it, but for migrants it is illegal employment. So they work without a written contract, or they work without having a work permit. And also, again, this measurement of education age for longer spells, how all these variables that can change this time, how are they measured. And very important that, in fact, you have males who move from Tajikistan to Russia. Most of the sample are males and moving to Russia. But then you have this gender variable and Russia as a destination country. What are the other countries then? So maybe just to exclude this tiny share of people going outside Russia to other countries, and maybe exclude also females because their share is very small. And then about the results. Is it possible to control for some other variables? Because R square is really quite small, less than 15% in all regressions for wages, I mean. So we really, you omit some important variables that explain wages. In general, in our countries, in post-Soviet countries, it is very difficult to find a good determinants of wages. But still, maybe there are some variables. And then these differences that you explained now in figures 3 and 4, you explained now, but it would be good to explain them in the paper, in a footnote or somewhere. And then about causality, you also mentioned, but it is interesting to think about the relationship between duration of migration and illegal work. What is the cause? What is because you tried this way and that way. So, and it is important for researchers to understand what is your hypothesis. I think that the causation comes from illegal employment to duration, and you found this negative relationship in one of your regressions. And then several interesting results that people with secondary education have lower wages than this primary education. And there is no difference between primary and tertiary education. Any interpretation of this, it is important. And then several interpretations for relationships would be useful for the reader. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. Unfortunately, I see people are coming for the next session. So if you have more questions, please ask them to the presenters and discussants. I apologize to everybody who wanted to ask and didn't have the opportunity. I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you very much. Stay with us further. Yes, just a second. The next session should be on family and gender or health? Or health? Family and gender. Family and gender.